Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC Streams session. Responding to Relativity, Stories of Two Indian Scientists, K Raychaudhuri and P.C. Vaidya. After the Nobel Prize in Physics was announced recently to Roger Penrose, there has been a renewed interest in the work of two Indian relativists who worked on Einstein's theory of relativity and whose work has been both appreciated and used by other scholars in the field. This is particularly true of Professor A.K. Raychaudhuri, whose work has been cited by Roger Penrose extensively. Professor A.K. Raychaudhuri and P.C. Vaidya made early and significant contributions to Einstein's theory of gravitation. Their work has been internationally recognized. Both of them worked in a university or college environment all through their careers and inspired over 3 generations of young students. In 2005, filmmakers Sunil, Shanbag and Swathi Dhandakar made biopics on both Professor Raychaudhuri and Professor Vaidya. The ongoing virtual film screening and this discussion aims not only to recall the significant contribution of both the scientists and their commitment to teaching, but also to reflect upon the need to document and contextualize the work being done in the sciences in India. These films were commissioned by the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. They are available to view on the BIC website until the 22nd of December. Filmmakers Swathi Dhandakar and Sunil Shanbag will be in conversation with theoretical physicist Bala Iyer and astrophysicist Ajit Parameswaran. This session is in collaboration with the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, ICTS. With that, I welcome Ajit to take the conversation forward.
Thank you, Lekha. Good evening. It's wonderful to host this discussion on two wonderful films about two wonderful scientists who were the pioneers of relativity in India. Today, we have with us filmmakers Sunil Shanbag and Swathi Dhandakar. They are joined by Professor Bala Iyer, who is a relativist at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences in Bangalore. Sunil Shanbag is a Mumbai-based theater director and documentary filmmaker. He has directed several acclaimed theater productions and movies. His films have received several awards, including the National Award for the Best Non-Fiction Film and the Ramsar Midwet Award at the Eco Cinema in Greece. Swathi Dhandakar is a documentary filmmaker from Bangalore with a special interest in creating visual narratives of the living history around her. Her film, Water and a City, was widely screened in India and abroad, and is part of the curriculum for courses in water management and development studies. At present, she teaches film at the Srishti Institute in Bangalore. Bala Iyer is a theoretical physicist who has made pioneering contributions to the calculation of gravitational waves. He is an elected fellow of the American Physical Society and the International Society of General Relativity and Gravitation. In the past, he has been the president of the Indian Association of General Relativity and Gravitation, which was founded by Professor P.C. Vaidya. Sunil, Swathi, and Bala, thank you for joining us today. So maybe we can start by setting the big picture. These movies are about two scientists who have made pioneering contributions to the field of general relativity and have influenced generations of students as teachers and as teachers and mentors. So perhaps Bala, maybe I can start by asking you, what is the relevance of the scientific work of P.C. Vaidya and A.K. Raychaudhuri?
The context of the work of Vaidya and Raychaudhuri is in the framework of the general theory of relativity. General relativity is Einstein's relativistic theory of gravitation given in 1915. It is described by Einstein's equations, a set of 10 complicated nonlinear partial differential equations that relate a given source to the curved geometry or the gravitational field it is associated with. Schwarzschild presented in 1916 an exact solution of the Einstein equations representing the gravitational field outside a static spherically symmetric body. Finding exact solutions of Einstein's equations was a challenging mathematical exercise and a predominant research area in the early years. Vaidya posed the question of whether Einstein's equations admit an exact solution for a radiating body. The insight that this may better be tackled using coordinates adapted to radiation led Vaidya in 1951 to the Vaidya metric, a solution describing what is called as null dust. Broadly, his research was in the area of exact solutions involving radiation, and in later years to solutions of Einstein's equations in cosmological backgrounds. The Vaidya solution is a nice toy model in problems involving radiation and has been used to model quasars, Hawking radiation, and so on. Interestingly, just today on the archive was a paper with a very intriguing title, Emmy's Letter to Santa Claus and a Reply, Vaidya Geometries and Scalar Fields with Null Gradients. With this, I move on to the work of Raychaudhuri. It's good to recall that this was the time general relativity was considered to be difficult and a useless subject, since there was no interaction between theory and experiment. A statement in Bergman's book, The Schwarzschild Singularity is Partly Singular, intrigued Raychaudhuri, leading to a Physical Review article where he showed that there is no theoretical limit to the degree of concentration and the Schwarzschild singularity occurs only in some coordinate systems. In this, he was disagreeing with Einstein's view. So it's interesting to see that even at an early stage, he was not afraid to take a stand on what he thought was right. Next, he began thinking about the other singularity, which is the Big Bang. In particular, the non singular Gödel solution, which had undesirable features. Wanting to improve on these features, which he later described as searching in the dark night for a black cat that did not exist. The questions he was trying to answer in his research were the following. Is the Big Bang singularity due to the strong symmetry assumptions of the Robertson Walker models? And secondly, is the cosmological constant needed to solve the timescale problem? The timescale problem refers to the contradiction which one has when one looks at the theoretical age of the universe and compares it with objects, ages of objects determined astronomically. In trying to find an answer to this question, Raychaudhuri found in 1953 what came to be called the Raichudi Equation, where he showed that the general derivation of the fundamental equation of gravitational attraction for pressure-free matter, showing the repulsive nature of the positive cosmological constant and the underlying basic singularity theorem. Essentially, he showed that physically, gravitational shear, which is the anisotropy of the velocity field, augmented collapse, while the centrifugal repulsion opposes it. This paper was submitted to the Physical Review in December 1953 and published in 1955. The 2 years which it took for this publication is also an interesting story by itself, which he recalls in one of the meetings where he spoke about his equation. Engelbert Schuking happened to read Raychaudhuri's article in the Physical Review and immediately recognized its importance. He coined the name Raychaudhuri equation, for this work. The Hamburg group applied and extended Raychaudhuri's work, and Raychaudhuri learnt of it through a letter from an Indian student, Brahmachari, who was a member of Jordan's group around 1956. Raychaudhuri was indeed very delighted about this recognition, which helped his standing in India a lot. It encouraged him to submit his work as a DSc thesis. John Wheeler was chosen as his external examiner, and he immediately recognized the significance of the work, and the DSc was granted in 1960 with honors. Regarding this work, I can just but quote the well-known physicist Ehlers. He said, the paper is a landmark in cosmology. It showed how results are in principle observable and local variables can be obtained without the imposition of symmetries. It was a forerunner to a program begun by Christian and Sachs and continued by George Ellis and his co-workers. It paved the way to the Penrose-Hawking singularity theorems, showing the existence of singularities under rather generic conditions. And indeed, as many of you know, the Nobel Prize this year to Penrose essentially is a recognition of the importance of this particular work. Extension to light-like geodesics by Sachs played an important part in gravitation radiation theory in connection with the peeling theorems, and later in the discussion of gravitational lensing for locating caustics in optical wavefronts. The primary reason behind its wide-ranging applicability is the fact that these equations encode geometric statements about flows, and as a consequence, it has applications in many different aspects of physics. Finally, Ehlers says he continued the line of great Indian physicists such as Saha, Raman, Bose, Baba, and Chandrasekhar. So, according to Ehlers, Raychaudhuri was in this top league of physicists who came from India. On the other hand, in a meeting to celebrate the Raichudi equation, Raychaudhuri himself said, "This was an elementary form of the equation. However, I had obtained it by a rather clumsy method so that it might appear that the equation was coordinate dependent. Anyway, in spite of all these developments, the relativity community has generously continued to refer to the equation in my name." To understand the influence of Raichaudhuri and Vaidya in mentoring the relativity community, I would like to begin to say that both Vaidya and Raichaudhuri as teachers influenced a far larger number of students in India, and not only people who worked in relativity. Vaidya in the teaching of maths at school and college levels, Raichaudhuri in teaching at a higher graduate school level. But as we know, both these are equally important. It is not sufficient to have good teaching at the master's level and neglect teaching at the primary level, and the other way around. And in a sense, therefore, both these people essentially were recognized in their contributions to being, excellent teachers who were admired for what they could give the students. To understand Raichaudhuri's attitude to all these matters, one can just look at the preface of his book on cosmology called Theoretical Cosmology, where he says, "The book aims to convey to the reader some of the excitement while not hiding the confusion that remains." It's an interesting philosophy, and if you are a teacher who can convey the excitement and also indicate where the fault lines lie, you can empower your students to a much larger extent. And in a sense, both these peoples seem to have succeeded in doing this. It's important to mention that Vaidya was instrumental in the setting up of the IAGRG, or the Indian Association for General Relativity and Gravitation, in 1969. It's interesting that this organization for relativity was set up in India before the International Society of General Relativity and Gravitation was set up in 1971. Vaidya and Raichaudhuri were part of the program for UGC schools on general relativity and cosmology in the 1980s, and also involved in the setting up of the ICGC meetings, the first one of which happened in 1987. All these activities essentially reoriented the research in general relativity towards topics which had interfaces with observations, astrophysics, and cosmology. There was need to reorient research in relativity, which was mainly in the discussion of exact solutions, in the discussion of the mathematical aspects to the areas which were sort of being pursued abroad as a consequence of the discovery of what was called as the emergence of relativistic astrophysics. The fact that relativity was important to discuss the objects, the observations which one were sort of seeing coming from radio observations, as X-ray observations and gamma ray observations and so on. I just end with a kind of speculation. What would have happened if Raychaudhuri worked at an institute and not in a college? Would the follow-up that happened based on his equations elsewhere in the world have also flourished in India? What would have happened if Vaidya continued at TIFR? Would the work on exact solutions which he was involved in be replaced by research in mathematical relativity as is happening in many centers in the world today? With that, I end my comments. Thank you for your attention.
And I said, no, just that this, what you've written is very nice. So he smiled. He was really happy that we had sort of connected with that, and he took it and he read it for us.
So you didn't ask him to do that?
No, he offered to read it, and you see it. It's there in the film.
Yeah.
And it was, he enjoyed going back to that, to what he had written. And because I think that really sums up the kind of person he was and how he sort of saw his work. And also what he says, he says, when I look at myself, I'm, maybe A minus, he says, not A plus, not A or A plus. It's a... and many little things, where we asked him, where do you work normally? He said, I work anywhere. He said, I work anywhere. And his wife said he can work in the fish market as well. It doesn't bother him. He's able to completely switch off from what's going on around him, be in the midst of things and still continue to work. That ability to just go within and start working. So
yeah, so this movie itself also has this very informal atmosphere, right? There is this pressure cooker going on in the background.
Yeah, it's his home. It's his home.
It's his home.
We'd be filming at around 3:34. They had a help, and she'd come in, and that was the time when we all stopped and had tea with them, because that was their tea time. We were actually fitting into their domestic schedule, and that was the whole point of it. That they shouldn't in any way feel that we are imposing, that we're really part of the thing, which is why you could, they were comfortable enough to talk and all that. I mean, there were moments when we were filming him while he was actually working at the dining table, and that's not fake. You can tell from the way he's doing. He's in thought. So what Swati was saying, that it's very much an important part of the kind of filmmaking that we do, that we try and become a little invisible at some points. The technology, the camera, the sound has a microphone that's hovering over your head, and it can be people glance up, and because it's something that might bump into your head, but you have to do it in such a way. I mean, both our camera person Sudhir and sound person Suresh, I mean, these are masters at their work. So they're able to create those conditions for people to feel extremely comfortable and talk. I think that's one of the critical things.
Yeah, while you keep this very informal atmosphere, also history seems to be keep coming back. Raychaudhuri talked about the Bengal famine, and Vaidya talks about the various aspects of freedom struggle, the Kutuna movement and the salt struggle, all these things. So
So we, as Sunil said earlier, we were very clear and we were interested in locating them, in a historical context. So those are also the kind of questions we asked. But also it is important. It was important for them too. For Raychaudhuri, the Bengal famine and what it meant for his family was an important part of his life, and in these events form you. They form your family. They affect you in so many ways, big and small. It's the uncertainty that it brings about, the worry about finding work, about about earning a living. All these affect you and your choices in life. So they're very important. And with Vaidya, there was a very, very clear engagement. He describes that scene where he's, and that's entirely his story. It's his story, because to him, that preoccupation with what is going to happen to Gandhiji at that time was very important. And for him, these two parallel worlds are within him. So that is so yes, it was important for us to locate it in a historical context, but it was also important for them, we found. And the other thing is that any work, any practice, whether it is in the sciences or anywhere else, does not exist in a vacuum, does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a historical, social, political, cultural context. And sort of, is there a value to looking at that work in that context? We think there is value in contextualizing the work, even the work in science. And while the early years of India's independence have been very well documented and written about in many other, for what they meant to the political economy, to society, to culture, to cinema, what it is that people have studied it. But there's not been as much work about what it meant for the practice of science in India. There have been stray articles written by scientists themselves, and there have been these institutional films, which is sort of the voice of the state, which is talking about, because those were the investments that India was making at that time in its dream of nation building. But that's one kind of narrative. There are many stories, and it's important to tell these stories, and therefore that historical context becomes very pertinent.
Yeah. And I was very interested in seeing that Vaidya quoted both Gandhi and Marx as kind of formative thing that sort of shaped him. That was very interesting to hear.
Yeah. But just, we also made a film tracing the 50 years of IIT Kanpur, the history as of that institution. And even in that film, we tried to look at it, as kind of parallel, because 50 years, in a sense, was parallel to the history of the nation also. So that you found points of connection between historical events and also what was happening at IIT Kanpur, and immediately opens it out. It opens it out to people. A much wider audience is able to access that history and understand the significance of the history. And I think that is what we have tried to do with the two scientist films.
Yeah, so there are some interesting questions from the audience. One was about the response that Meghnad Saha had about the research direction that Raychaudhuri had proposed, and apparently he discouraged him. And that appears very strange, because usually Saha come across as not only a great scientist but also has a visionary, has some kind of egalitarian outlook and so on. Someone who is very different from the elite scientists. Is there any understanding on why Saha thought that this area of research is not useful or promising?
Is the question to Bala?
I don't know if any of you
right? We cannot answer this.
Do you have any understanding of this?
No, I can only guess, because I have not read anything about it. My guess is that people like Saha basically felt that there are more useful things to be sort of done at that particular point. I can't really see him scientifically assessing the rightness or wrongness of that, but probably his feeling that maybe if you are at a, because he was also politically conscious himself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, and therefore I guess that as part of an institute, he basically felt that things which should be done, which were at that particular point, as I mentioned, considered to be not very useful, more of formal interest, of mathematical interest, rather than anything to do with the real world, whether that should be encouraged at all. So I think it is the lack of really being able to see ahead, but also related to what he thought should be the priority of a country at that particular time. That's the only thing I could think of.
Yeah. So there is another
I had a
interesting
question
question
to Sunil and Swati. When talking to Raychaudhuri, did he say something which lets you have a contrary view?
Not a not a contrary view. In fact, he talks about the difficulties that he faced and how he had to take a very strong position on that. In fact, right, Swati?
Yes, he, I mean, as to why he was discouraged, he does not say, but he does say that he was discouraged very strongly, not just by Saha but by others too, and he was continuously pushed. He was, for instance, asked to work with condensed matter physics, and he was not interested in working in condensed matter physics. So he really had to push back and say uh, that he won't work in this field, but he will continue to work in what he wanted to work with. And even his PhD was not easy for him, because his supervisor expected him to work again in a particular way, and he felt that it was not taking him anywhere. So he sort of stopped seeing him, in a sense, and he just worked on his own. And he is a little bitter about those years, because he did find it very, very difficult, but he didn't really, I don't remember him saying as to why Saha sort of expected him to not work in this, except that he felt that it was not a field that was of much use. So perhaps what you also mentioned earlier. He said that it was not going to be much use working here. It was not going to go anywhere. I think that's what I remember him saying.
So
Raychaudhuri.
Janvi Falke, who is also a historian of science, has a very interesting point to make in the chat box. So she says that Meghna Saha was the president of the IACS between 1946 and 51 and died in 56. And SN Bose, on the other hand, was the president of the IACS between 58 and 62. Might this be something that got mixed up in Raychaudhuri's memory? Or did he categorically mention Saha? Or this is something that you kind of inferred during his research?
No, he mentioned Saha quite categorically, but not only Saha. He mentioned Saha, but he also mentioned others, in the sense that see, his take on this was that's why I said that none of the big names of that time in Bengal, in Kolkata, at that time seemed to have encouraged him.
Right. So let's move on to this other aspect. So another aspect of, clearly the aspect of making the movies to tell the story visually, right? And you seem to have used some very interesting visual language, especially in the movie on Vaidya, etc. So how did you come up with this visual language?
Well, at one level, these are fairly straightforward films. Okay, we used usually when you make a slightly more personal film, and you tend to use different techniques. But this was a fairly straightforward film. A lot of it was aimed in providing information to the viewer, to the audience. But we were also keen on working at a slightly more subconscious level, build in layers that would at least address some subconscious layers. And again, it's the personalities of the two scientists and what they said and how they saw their own work and their own engagement with their work that sort of prompted that. So with Raychaudhuri, if you notice, it's very quiet. There is a lot, most of it the time he's at home. There are only a few occasions when he steps out, and they are special occasions. It is a home. We try to reproduce the feel of that home. There's it's a ground floor house, so there are areas of darkness and light. So we tried not to change that, and you get that sense of a cocoon in which he lives and he works. Okay, domesticity is very strong. The household noises. There's a kitchen. There's all that, right? Very clearly. With Vaidya, on the other hand, it's very different. I mean, the first thing that he told us is that when he sees mathematics everywhere in everything. And that was something that we'd like to suggest through the film, that, the fact that he's constantly surrounded in this world, he lives in this, immersed in this world of mathematics. Some of it was achieved through using graphics, and some of it was also achieved in the way we actually frame things. You keep looking for mathematical visual combinations. You look for elements that would actually contribute to that idea. So yeah, that's how it actually develops. Yeah, that's how we worked on it.
You also use some very interesting archival footage, right? And those really conveyed the spirit of those times. There was this footage certainly on the freedom struggle and this Vallabh Vidyanagar and all these things.
Yeah, so the archival footage on the independence movement is not difficult. I mean, that's available.
Yeah.
You just have to have enough money to pay for it, but it's available. We have the films division has archives, the Gandhi Foundation has archives, so that is not a problem. I think we were very lucky to stumble on the Vallabh Vidyanagar material. I remember that we located that there was such a film made, which was fantastic, but we had to send somebody to Gandhinagar to get hold of it, and we were already back in Bombay by then, and so a friend was contacted in Ahmedabad. His son was free. He got onto a scooter, went there, located it. So that was quite exciting to get hold of that material, and it's always very interesting to get hold of archival material. I mean, it really, yes. I don't know, there's something magical about archival material. It just makes you, this brings such a reality.
Transports you back into that, yeah.
And it worked so well with Vaidya's memories, of a classroom with no roof, because those are the early days of that university. And even though that archival film that we got, even though it's an institutional film made in that style, even then it still is able to convey the spirit of the early days, the sense of idealism. And that was wonderful in that material. Otherwise, you could easily be stuck with very boringly shot and, slightly dead material. But this was very alive. Yeah.
This is like real film stock or digital material?
Well, it was shot on film, and we managed to get it on video. We had to work on it to give it a certain reasonable quality because, it was, we got it on consumer video format, the VHS, what was known as VHS in those days. And we had to kind of, work on it to give it a little more brightness, a little more quality so that we could actually use it in the film. Yeah.
So one of the participants asked a very interesting question, Pulkit Mota. After going through this process of making this film, did you observe any changes in these two gentlemen, or did it change yourself?
I mean, every film changes you, Every film changes you because for the purpose of making that film, you enter a universe and you inhabit that universe for that length of time. It is so the people in it, the ideas, the that's what you're thinking about all the time, and so it changes you. And so yes, in that sense, these two films did too, and it for both of us, as Sunil said, that this was the first time that we were making a film about scientists. So we had also entered, and suddenly it all opened out. And in fact, what happened thereafter is that because these films were seen then by somebody in an IIT Madras screening in Chennai, and then he thought that another film like this should be made on somebody who has designed experiments. And so we sort of started to we made after that films on another scientist and on two science institutions. So I would say that the questions that we had kind of begun engaging with through these films stayed with us and sort of all through the rest of the films too. And the questions were these. In fact, Bala mentioned them earlier, that, there has been in India this sort of discourse on whether, that about the setting up of specialized institutes for science research, and therefore universities, which are then under the state government, whereas these institutes, which are centrally funded, are sort of a little higher in terms of the hierarchy of the kind of funds they receive and the kind of facilities they have, and the universities don't have that. And what then happens to the quality of research in the university? What happens to the fact that research and teaching do not come together as strongly as they would have had all the research happened also in universities and not in these institutes? These are questions that have come up in almost every film about scientists or science institutions that we have made after this. So yes, that is the kind of you sort of enter a universe, and then it never really goes away. Na? You remain a part of that universe, even if you've finished making the film. You remain a part of it in some way. Sunil, I don't know. You want to ask?
It's just that it's one thing that you go and shoot the film and you come back. That doesn't take very long. Maybe a week, 8 days, 10 days, whatever, right? What happens is that, especially when films are driven by what people have said, so interview-based films, okay, you shoot a lot of stuff. I mean, you may shoot 6 hours of interview material, 5 hours of interview material, and the editing process requires you to listen to them speaking again and again and again, so that you can understand what they're saying, and you're able to actually structure an argument or structure a chronology. And those hours of listening to them and watching them very closely, because most of the interviews are fairly tight, you can see the face very clearly, you begin to know these people very intimately. All right, every little expression, every little smile, every little twinkle, that tells you something about. And you must remember, you're seeing this repeatedly. And it's quite strange, because that person doesn't really know you, but if you happen to meet the person who you made a film on, you are so familiar with that person, and sometimes the person is odd. I mean, why is this guy being so familiar, and you forget that he doesn't know you at all, right? So I think any work of this kind will have an impact on you, because you get to know people very deeply, and you learn to read not from the obvious but from the less obvious. I think that has an impact on your mind. It leaves something behind.
There is another interesting question that Muttala Ramanathan is asking. So these are both wonderful films, and so was there any material in your conversations with the scientists about their childhood education that made them the kind of thinkers that they became?
I think we've got in the film, Raychaudhuri talks about his childhood, right? Yes. And he talks about his experiences as a student. I don't remember about Vaidya. Did we? I don't remember. Swati, do you remember?
No, he didn't. Vaidya did not sort of specifically mention his school education. He mentions his college education, because he went to Mumbai. He went to the Ismail Yusuf College in Mumbai for his BSc, and then he went to what was then called the Royal Institute of Physics. So later, Institute of Physics. So that's where he did his MSc. So those days he remembers, and those years he remembers. Raychaudhuri very clearly mentions his experience in school, where he talks about how he was
not a great student in class and so on.
Sorry?
He was not such a great student in class.
He was not such a great student. His brother was a better student, and he was known as his brother's sort of brother. But he does mention that he had solved a problem, and it was and it came in the school magazine, and then the teacher who so that relationship with the subject sort of comes through. And also in his school, he had thought that he would study mathematics, Raychaudhuri. But his father was a mathematics teacher, and his father thought that mathematics may not help him earn a living as easily, and therefore he chooses physics. Now this is
yeah, well, on the other hand, you have Vaidya saying, I mean, see, Vaidya had this this great burden of expectation on his shoulders. He felt that, his father on his deathbed talks about the last instruction he leaves to the family is that Vaidya, the young boy who was, still in school, must complete his graduation, right? And he felt very strongly about that that it was, so he says that, I mean, so is it any wonder that I had to become a world renowned scientist? So I think people have different, different influences on their childhood. It would be wonderful to explore this further, but you can't do everything. These are long lives.
But then he switched gears, right? He got interested in the education at school level. This is another question from another audience.
Because Vaidya also, see, he had a very particular view of mathematics education, and he felt, I mean, for instance, he was a believer that, that early education, even in mathematics, must happen in the mother tongue. He believed that, and it's a view that becomes, and he says it. He said it clearly. It's a view that is a difficult view to hold, because there are so many other views that, particularly in the teaching of sciences, it was even if you go to a Gujarati or a Marathi or a Hindi medium school, very often the science and mathematics would be taught in English. Because somehow that was the language. But he in fact believed otherwise, because he believed that arithmetic, much of the arithmetic he felt that we learn in our school years, is something that was developed here, and it was developed in our own languages, so we should actually teach it like that. And so he had a very particular view of it.
Yeah.
But you said there was a question that was somewhat different, was it?
This is like, what was the circumstance in which he got interested in this school education, and what was the motivation behind it?
The motivation, as he also speaks in the films, is that he felt that, and I think I said this earlier, that the abilities that he had, the position that he had acquired, of it put that responsibility. He believed that that is what put the responsibility on him to not just look at his own science and his own science practice and teaching only MSc and PhD level students, but that he should engage with with the larger society beyond these institutions. And particularly because he saw mathematics as being everywhere, like what Sunil said. So to him it was nobody told him this, but he felt that this was his responsibility, because that's the kind of person he was. So he took upon himself the setting up of that Gujarat Ganit Mandal, and starting those activities and getting the teachers together, and instilling confidence in the teachers, to getting them to converse with each other about how mathematics needs to be taught. Having statewide, the mandal has statewide meetings. They gather together and meet, and then take, and that large vision that we mentioned, that he began with the postgraduate, because he said that it was smaller. The number of people who are doing post-graduation and who are teaching at the postgraduate level is smaller, and therefore easier to deal with. And it's only when you train them, you have to train teachers. And once those teachers at the postgrad level are trained, then they will train the undergrad level teachers, because they will be teaching the undergrad, and so on. So that was his vision, and this was his vision. I mean, nobody told him. He just felt that that's what he needed to do, because he was that kind of a person who believed, who had a very, very strong sense of social responsibility.
Yes.
Extremely strong sense of social responsibility.
And
he believed that he needed to do it.
And the other thing is, whenever we think of such things, he always did not, he had the idea of how to convert something small into a bigger movement, a mass movement. So whatever was the idea which he probably imbibed during the freedom struggle, right? There's no point if we just influence two people, it's not going to change the
Yes.
society unless you have a plan by which, hierarchically you increase the engagement. Only then you can make a difference. And that also, as he says, will take you 20 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not going to happen
Yes.
overnight.
Absolutely.
Yes. How to scale up the activity and how to, so sort of ascertain the time scale involved in doing it, right? I think it was very interesting to see him at work.
Yeah, I think completely breaking this stereotype, of a scientist who tends to
Yes.
keep away in their own little world. And here's somebody who's out there, out there and engaging widely with people. It's very, very inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah, the strategy was also very sort of clever, right? He had this very clear strategy, and this teaching first, the postgraduate teachers first, and then sort of scale it up, building this whole pyramid under them. Yeah, it must be something that is that he sort of learned from the Gandhian period.
And
yeah, I
also
think so.
the other
Organizing.
thing, sorry, go on.
Sorry, no, please, Bala.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, was was way off. We talk about setting up these places, the Vikram Sarabhai Center, which is set up in Ahmedabad, the mathematics laboratory or whatever he called it.
Yes.
Right. It was interesting to really see that activity which started very early on. He had a role to play in that.
Yeah, so someone sort of asked Tarun Chaubisa. Can you sort of talk a little bit? It's probably a bit of out of context, but what was really the change in the mathematics teaching that he sort of tried to bring in, apart from using the mother tongue? Are there any sort of difference in the way that mathematics was taught in his style, rather than just it's an arithmetic
from what I understand of this, I mean, I'm no sort of scholar of education, the field of education, but from what I understand, he tried to make it much more conceptual.
Yes,
and
exactly.
not sort of the learning. So to use physical, tangible material around you, because he saw mathematics everywhere. He felt that it was important to use all those things that you see around you in your understanding of mathematics.
Yeah, so he uses math lab idea, right? Mathematics lab.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in fact, it how these things influence, you can see, because when we were filming at the Sarabhai Center in Ahmedabad, it was we have such a, because as Indians, we have a somewhat poor sort of opinion and sense of how public institutions of this kind function, because we believe that people will break and things won't last. But it was fascinating to see that Sarabhai Center on a Sunday. Children arrived with their parents and they just went and started to engage with all those things, the toys, the math and science toys that were kept there. And they were engaged with them, they were working with them. Schools would bring students on other days. On Sundays they would just come, and it was a lively, busy, healthy, sort of robust activity going on at that place. And it doesn't just happen. It's not only Vaidya. There was Sarabhai himself, and there were sort of people there who worked at the Sarabhai Center, who encouraged this kind of activity. But I'm saying this culture of coming doesn't just happen. It happens. There is the impact is sort of often not immediately apparent, but it can be seen in so many different ways, like this instance. Or for instance, teachers feeling more confident about teaching. And I feel a lot has to do with that as well. That teachers struggle to teach. That was his point, that mathematics is not difficult to learn, but it's difficult to teach. And so the teachers needed to feel confident enough to teach. And how would that happen? How can that be brought about? So that is why in the film you also see some teachers and how they, how their ways of teaching changed.
Professor Ramswamy makes a very encouraging comment that this is a great way to popularize science itself. Any more films coming out in the near future?
This is a thing that we talk about very often. We feel that first of all, he's right that there's not enough of this kind of work happens in India. Some days ago, I was sent a questionnaire by Vigyan Prasad. And this was a questionnaire that asked questions about, do you think films on science are popular in India? Do you think there is enough talent to make science-based films in India? Why do you think science-based films are not seen enough? Why do you think? There are many such questions. And I took the time to answer that questionnaire, and really because of our experience of having worked through these films, I feel one is, of course, the idea of even making these films. See, science is, compared to other fields, it is inaccessible to people outside the sciences, particularly something like physics. It is. People don't know. So the push and the drive to sort of, if you look at this as science communication or documenting the practice of science, the push for this also has to sort of originate and from within the sciences, and then there can be a collaboration. But it's not a field that people outside access so easily to sort of come up and say, for us to say, about this aspect of science, I will make a film. That doesn't happen. If there are science filmmakers who are themselves familiar with science, yes, that might happen. But I think that the drive for this does need to originate from within the domain itself. That's one. And we find that science institutions in India, which happen to be, as institutions go, some of the better funded institutions as compared to those in the arts and humanities, do not really take that keen an interest in this. I mean, look at Vigyan Prasad itself. They did send us that questionnaire, and they did the funding for these films, which Ayuka commissioned, came from Vigyan Prasad. But if we were to ask, what have they done to actually distribute these films, to make them available easily to people within India, to colleges, to universities? And the answer, unfortunately, is that very little has been done. We wonder why an institution that has the mandate, in fact, to do this should be so, should sort of, I can only use the word apathy here, about the distribution of them. I mean, particularly now, earlier you could even say that you had to make VHS tapes earlier and then later DVDs and physically distribute. Today, you can't say that. There is the virtual space. And what does it really take to sort of put these to run a channel, for instance, of science, films on science?
A YouTube channel.
Yes, which is, I mean, it happens in an informal way from people who, people who like something, they put it up. But I'm saying in a more formalized sort of thought through way, of making things available. And these films too, I mean, it was a very good thing that the people in Ayuka thought of these films, I mean, just in time. We finished filming with Professor Raychaudhuri, and he passed away after a few months. He did not even survive to see the film being made fully. So, so yes, we would be very happy to, if institutions sort of started to look at the process of, I mean, if we believe that there's a value to documenting practice and the practice of science, and if we see a value in that, then yes, there should be, the institution should be taking a much more active, playing an active role in it.
Are there, successful
Sunil, you want to sort of add something to this?
Yeah, do you want to add something, Sunil?
Who, me? Are you asking me? No, you said it all.
Yeah,
No, I
okay.
mean, I cannot, we cannot, overstate the importance of the decision that was, I don't know what happened internally and how they came about it, but, Ayuka actually commissioning this film was such an important thing. And, one
Yes.
has to completely, congratulate them for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So are there examples, good examples that of institutions who follow these sort of good practices which we can emulate? You brought up not so good examples.
Well, I think you can talk about the ISER example, for instance. I mean, the fact that they wanted to, here was a very, very, a center of excellence and, very important initiative. And they wanted to actually document the early years of setting up an institution. Where often what happens is when an institution settles down and is established and settles down and thoda sa, kind of becomes a little more rigid, some of the early spirit, sometimes there's a danger of it dissipating. And here was an institution that actually wanted to capture that while it was actually being founded and set up. Swati, actually, that's an interesting example you could give. Yeah.
Yes.
No, absolutely. So, and I agree that this Ayukas and I said they have this wonderful timely decisions to commission these movies. But I was think of institutions whose job is to archive and distribute and make movies and so on.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how proactive they are, frankly. I mean, it would be wrong for us to say something conclusively because honestly, the work has come to us. So it's not that we have pitched it and then found it difficult. So, it cannot, we can't say that. But look, this is a very, very important field. I think it's of great significance to everybody. We can't keep talking about scientific temper and not do something about it. We have to tell stories. We have to make these connections for people. We have to be able to connect to people who are not directly interested in science or in engaging in science, right? And in order to do that, films and stories of these kind, among many other things that you can do, of course, are very, very critical. And I think it needs to be done. Documentation has to be done. Archiving has to be done. We have to know the past in order to understand the present and to plan the future. There's no getting away from it. Okay. And we can't do that by just telling stories and anecdotes. That doesn't work. We love telling stories, anecdotes. Aisa hua tha. That doesn't work. You need well worked out documentation, with whatever. Yeah, that's critical.
Yeah, because we are no longer just an oral people, an oral history. We say that we are sort of oral storytellers. That's the way we have, preserved and documented things in India. But that's not. First of all, that is a sort of a somewhat scattered archive, no, because it exists then in people's memories. And what happens when people go away and people sort of die and pass on? It needs to be, even if it is the retelling of it orally, are we going to record it and preserve it for posterity in some form? Because those are now that is how we work, right? We don't only work in just the oral medium. We work, we all write, these are the different media that we use in all our work, and our practice happens through these. So those are the media that we have to use also to archive and to document. And it is not something, unfortunately what happens is, like, we were making a film on IIT Kanpur, which also was directed by Sunil and produced by his company Chrysalis Films. And when we started research for this film, and when I went to IIT Kanpur, I was shocked to find that there was nothing that they had preserved. No material,
no archive,
no material, no photographs, no archival material of any kind. They had the first sort of closed circuit television in the country. And I heard that there was a cupboard full of tapes with material that was shot at that time, which had not been looked after. And in the extreme climate of Kanpur, the tapes sort of melted and stuck, and finally that entire cupboard was emptied out as scrap. So there was no material to be found, and in fact, material on IIT Kanpur was found in the MIT archives. There were 6 boxes clearly labeled IIT Kanpur, which and in which we found fascinating material about IIT Kanpur, fascinating material about the institution, about the personal histories of the people who were there, because IIT Kanpur was set up with American collaboration, right? So, and it was a consortium of universities headed by MIT, and therefore MIT had kept it. Now, look, we do understand that there is no comparison in terms of resources, and it does take resources to set up an archive, to preserve material. We do understand that. It's not that I mean, I'm not saying that why are we, but I don't think that it is that difficult for institutions of this size and stature to actually set aside a little bit of. It's not, I don't think it's just a question of funds. You have to believe that it's important. You have to believe that it's important. In fact, somebody here has asked, what can a student of an university to do to popularize and contribute to science communication? And I want to make a connection with what we are talking about now and his question, that, what is the most important thing in this? The willingness to communicate. That has to be there first. You have to want to communicate. So does this domain and this realm of science, do they wish to communicate? And given that much of the work, and I'm not just pointing fingers at science, I'm saying much of the work that happens in all our academic institutions is, after all, public funded. It's public funding, for all these. So in a sense, that puts a greater responsibility, does it not? So I feel there has to be this will to communicate, and if there is that will to communicate, then one has to go about it in a professional way. It's not just that I had took some photographs and somebody took some photographs, and just out of personal initiative, one person has gathered them. No, archiving and libraries and documentation are all sort of professional fields, and there are people who do it professionally. So that, I think, needs to be set up and created.
Yeah.
But for that, you have to believe it's important.
Yeah, that's right. So no, we as a scientist, we will take it as a self-criticism. But I think the new institutions are taking it more seriously, especially the communicating science and outreach. And the new generation of scientists also, I hope, are doing better than our previous generations. There is a better consciousness that we are public funded and we have the responsibility to communicate to people who fund us. And I think that has been happening the last decade better, in a better way. Perhaps Bala, as a person who has seen science in India over the last 50 years or so, what do you think, Bala? Is the situation changing for the better or worse?
Yeah, in terms of, public outreach, as you rightly say, for example, the younger generation is definitely more conscious and there are more means to do it. But I still feel that in terms of documenting, the history of what is really happening, there is probably a more serious question of why it doesn't happen, right? I mean, it's somewhere there has to be a kind of structure which people believe in, about how you sort of, for example, there's no problem in getting a film made about Vaidya and Raychaudhuri. But suppose you sort of say that, okay, let's start making films about X, Y, and Z. Then very soon it gets into personality clashes. Who should be the next guy whose movie should be made. So somehow, even in spite of practicing science for so many years, I still feel that we have not been able to come up with a gold standard as a community, that when we come up with a particular thing, that we will believe in it and we will go by it. There is always, as they keep saying, the crab mentality at work or something like that. So that also probably hampers the creation of oral history. You really don't want the oral history in an objective fashion. You want to see it with a larger subjective color. Then probably happens in more established places like the US, for example. So there is a sociological problem and a cultural element to the non-existence of this kind of material. I don't know whether I'm being cynical, but
It's interesting what you say. It's very interesting.
yeah.
But you know what happens, Ajit, is that when the minute you do a project like this, I mean, Swati gave the example of IIT Kanpur not having its own archive and stuff like that. But by the time we finished the film 2 years later, we had created a huge archive for them, simply because we had shot interviews with generations of people who have gone through IIT Kanpur. So you have oral histories, 1 hour, 2 hour interviews with these people, 50, 60 hours of incredible oral history. We had gathered over 600 to 800 photographs from the alumni. Okay, so there was a visual archive. All this is of great value. And of course, you have caught an institution at a particular moment in history while you're filming the present, right? And that becomes tomorrow, it immediately is part of history. So there's a great value in these projects. It kind of adds up.
No, yeah, I understand, and I think it still we are a relatively younger society and a younger country as compared to countries like US, which has institutions of very long-standing tradition, and I hope that as time progresses, we will get more and more serious about documenting our own history and our own lives, so that we will also preserve the spirit of our times for future.
So, yeah, because the main point is, to sort of realize that we are accountable not only to ourselves, but accountable to the society and the times we live in, right? Yeah. And unless that comes in, right, I mean, it is very difficult to really plan from where we are to where we should be going.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is responsibility of communicating, and I also feel that there is an interest. I mean, for instance, we are not science people, but if something is made accessible to us, we are interested in knowing what happens, say, in a particular realm. And there are many people who are interested. So just also at the level of as Sunil was saying, that scientific temper won't just happen. If you make something accessible, you are increasing awareness among the people among whom you sort of live and work. And I always feel very grateful when somebody sort of makes something accessible to me and says it to me, because I feel otherwise I would not be able to understand it. So, and I know that it's not easy. It takes some doing. So I feel it's both. It's sort of the thing to communicate and also to document and sort of archive. I feel both are equally important.
Okay, so I think with this cautious optimism, let's stop this today's conversation. There is a hand up from Professor Narayan Banerjee, who was a former student of AKR and appeared in the movie also. So I didn't see it. Apologize. So Professor Banerjee, would you like to ask your question? So you need to unmute Professor Banerjee.
Yeah. Two minor comments, but we moved far away from that when we were talking about AKR. One comment is that his doctorate degree was not a PhD, but rather a DSc.
DSc.
And the second is, yes, Meghnad Shah advised him to do condensed matter physics and not gravity. Bala perhaps made the reasons clear because he felt that was useful. And AKR did some condensed matter physics research, theoretical condensed matter, which was appreciated by none other than Coulson. Some theoretical research. So these two comments I wanted to make. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
It was a great evening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Narayan.
Thank you very much, Swati, Sunil, and Bala.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. Thank you, and thank you, Bala.
Thank you.
And
Thank you to
all.
BIC.
That's right. Thank you to BIC, and
Yes.
thanks to all of you who have attended and asked very interesting questions and made interesting comments.
And also a couple of questions which if they didn't get answer, if there's a possibility to send it by email, I'd be happy to answer them.
Right.
Yes, there were some questions which were specifically, I think, to you, Bala.
Yes, we'll take up this one, and I can share this with the Bala. I didn't bring this up because of probably not too much related to the context of our conversation today. Yeah.
We'll send all the questions over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you all, and have a very good evening.
Yeah. And unlikely, but of course, natural and organic coming together of the artist and the scientist. This has been a complete pleasure to be able to listen to this conversation. Thank you, Swati and Sunil, for making these lovely films. Thank you, Bala and Ajit, for bringing your perspectives to this conversation that range from humanities to physics to archives to public spaces. Telling stories about and with a scientific temper is something that we're all going away with this evening. Thank you, audience, for joining us, and most of all, thank you, professors AKR and Vaidya, for being the two reasons making this moment in time possible.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, and good night, and see you next time.
Good night. Bye-bye. Yes.
Bye. Thank you, Ajit. Thank you, Bala.
Bye, all.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Bye, Sunil. Bye, Swati.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.